All right, so before we get going here, once again, kind of walk through some class stuff. So by the end of the day today, you need to complete that kind of third quiz. You need to complete that second Canvas discussion. Um, and then I think one of the daily quizzes, yeah, that ninth one is was due before we started class today. That July 10th quiz from last week is due before we start class tomorrow. Um, You also have that Module 8 reading. I think I mentioned to those of you who were live last week, and I put up an announcement that changed this. I think I had said that it was due today. Because we're going to still work on some Module 7 stuff today. I think the due date in the syllabus was tomorrow. I'm going to keep that the same to be before we start class tomorrow. That Module 8 kind of top hat is due. You've got the practice problems for the next quiz, so I'm not going to have that quiz pop up or set to release until after we cover all the material tomorrow. That would then be due by the end of the day on Thursday, right? Um, I'll have it set so that once you complete it, you can view kind of what answers you got, what problems you got correct or not. You can't see the answers, but you can see if you got them wrong and try to kind of rework them. If you have any questions on the ones you're reworking, you can reach out to me. But because it's still open, I can't kind of have the answers set to release. But those of you who want to work in advance to kind of make sure you're studying for that second midterm, which is Friday, I'll mention things about that in a second. You'll be able to kind of see which ones you got right and wrong. Okay. Studying for that midterm exam, which is once again this Friday, you can use those practice problems from quiz 3 and quiz 4. You'll have, once you complete that quiz, kind of those problems to work through. And then I have the review video almost ready to go. I've got it all recorded. I just have to kind of splice some of them together. So I'll get that posted to YouTube later this afternoon when I post up the class recording from today. Um, Other than that, I will post the second Canvas quiz tomorrow. Canvas quiz, sorry, third Canvas discussion tomorrow. That won't be due until the Tuesday following kind of the exam. So I'll kind of walk through that tomorrow. Um, Kind of outline what you're gonna do there. You don't have to do it before the exam, which is why I give a few days to work on it after the fact. And it'll look very similar to this past Canvas discussion in terms of what is expected of you. And then I also put up, and I see that in the chat, I'll get to it here in just a second. Um, I'm thinking about using a different service to kind of proctor these exams. And so it won't necessarily use a lockdown browser, but it records everything you do. And if you access other web pages, if you don't just have the Canvas pulled up, it'll flag your submission. So essentially, you are locked out. You could open something up, but as soon as you do, that's going to be counted as though like academic dishonesty, right? So you shouldn't be opening any other browsers, and I'll kind of set that forward in the instructions. Um, I am not 100% that I'm going to use it. I want to see how this test goes first. So I created a midterm exam number 2 honor lock test. It has 3 questions. I just want to make sure all the types of questions are working with it. One thing that's going to change for this next exam, either way, is you're only going to be displayed 1 question at a time. So that might slow up things a little bit, but it also prevents people from kind of printing these out, having this set and kind of working through them. It's going to require you to kind of focus on each question before you move to the next one. So I have that kind of setting in this test exam. I have the due date set to be due by the end of the day tomorrow, so I can look at it Wednesday, Thursday, and make sure that everything looks good. And whether or not I'm going to use it will kind of depend on if we have any issues and what kind of uh, recorded answers look like for that. To look out for an announcement, and I'll talk about, I'll announce this in class on Thursday when we do review live. I mentioned last week we won't have a live class on Wednesday. We have that kind of replacement video of me just working through practice questions or practice problems. And then any additional questions, it's just a review session basically on Thursday as well. We'll complete Module 8 material by the end of the day tomorrow. Okay, so that's kind of my spiel. See the question. So we're allowed to use our phones as calculators. No, you can't have your phones out at any point in time during this exam. Once again, it's going to record you. So you need to make sure you have a working um, camera, right, that can observe you as you're taking the exam. So that's going to be part of this. You can go back to previous questions once you kind of move on. So you will be, it's not like once you answer, you're locked in. You can go back. It's just going to display one question to you at a time. It will have a scientific calculator that's available for you to use through, it's called Honor Lock. I don't know if any of you used it before in other classes, but I'll have a calculator you can use that it'll pop up on your uh, computer, or you can use a scientific calculator if you have a physical one as well. That's kind of noted in the instructions for the proctors. Okay.
I have a question about the honor lock thing too.
Yep.
I was wondering like, so I know how you mentioned last exam that it was like technically open note. Would that like
Mhm.
flag something for this exam? Like, so
Nope.
to close.
You can have like notes in front of you and available to you. You can have I mean, technically the textbook, but since it's an e-text, you could print that out to have that in front of you as well.
Okay.
Um, but really just blank paper and then kind of any notes you've taken is primarily what you're going to be allowed to use.
Okay, cool.
Yep. Any other questions before we get moving? And once I said, like I said, once I see how the test goes, I'll put an announcement up about some more detailed instructions with that and talk about them at the beginning of Thursday's class when we're doing that live review. Okay. Any other questions before we get going here? Okay. Should we? No, I have it set to be due by the end of the day. The quicker you complete it, the quicker I can make sure it's working and get kind of that set of instructions together. But I just want to make sure it's working for the majority of people. It's not worth any points. It looks like it has points attached to it, but it's not going to be counted into the grade book. I just want to make sure it's scoring things correctly, that you're able to kind of get whatever device and whatever recording device that you're going to use on Friday to be working. It's just kind of a test there. Okay. Other questions? Okay. So let's kind of pick up where we left off. So we were talking about this relationship, finding kind of break-even points. Oh, I saw one more question pop up here. Do you have to download? Yeah. Long. But yeah, you will have to download before you access, which is why I said kind of starting earlier to make sure you're getting it done before the end of the day tomorrow would be helpful. Okay. So we left off kind of thinking about finding this break-even equilibrium level of GDP where the potential real GDP, so that's another way you can think about this 45-degree line. It's when all the disposable income or all resources in an economy are being used for expenditures, whether or not that's consumption, individuals, investment like firms, government spending, or net exports. So we talked about those different things would shift, not the potential GDP line, but shift the actual kind of expenditure line. So I sometimes will call this actual consumption. To be technically, it's consumption investment, it's any like consumption by anyone, but you know, consumer consumption, um, investments in the physical capital consumption or expenditures, government expenditures, etc. So we talked about how kind of this shifts this line. We'll kind of look through an Excel example today, and then I'll kind of return to this to kind of draw some, connect that Excel example with what's going on visually in the graph. Okay. All right. Hopefully, I don't need that. I don't know what that was a prompt for. So we left off thinking about how do we calculate that actual consumption, right? So that we can then solve for. So here we had like actual consumption. We can rearrange this equation to find what that break-even level is. So it had our autonomous consumption, it had investment, it had government spending, net exports. We then subtracted out taxes because this is an expenditure model, right? You think about, I got a question, government, the government gets taxes, but right there, that's a revenue. That's not an expenditure for them. So the way that we're kind of capturing taxes is through consumers here, and we're just thinking about consumer taxes first. I introduced the idea of business taxes kind of later on today. So we're subtracting out the taxes people have to pay because they can't use that for consumption. Okay. So this was kind of our solution for that break-even level of consumption. We could put in different values. And I could give you what all these values are, and you could solve for that equilibrium level. So I have an example here, and I think we kind of worked through it, so I'll revisit in Excel, but what if investments instead of 600 were 800 or a $200 increase? And then what instead we saw that What do I have here? Investments go up by, I'm sorry, investments go up by 800. Then what happens if taxes increase? So we're going to kind of work through both of these examples. That'll kind of tie us into this multiplier effect. So we're going to take a look at this in Excel and then kind of return to the slides here. Okay. So last class, we worked through these examples where we kind of primarily focused on these two right here to start out. So I gave you autonomous consumption, I gave you investment, government expenditures, taxes, and the exports. So that equation, we said we were going to add up autonomous consumption, investment in physical capital, government spending, net exports, and then we're going to subtract taxes times that marginal propensity to consume. Okay? So when we did that, we had an initial break-even real GDP of 4,525. If investments then went to 800, we use that exact same equation, but now we have this higher investment level. Notice it's went up by 200, but when we look at that change in GDP, it's actually went up by 1,000. So why is that the case, right? If we looked at our function, I can get my mouse over here. There we go. When we were solving this, right, any increase in investment gets divided by 1 over the marginal propensity to consume, which we know is less than 1. So a denominator less than 1 would increase, right, any change in either investment, government spending, net exports, or autonomous consumption. And we'll think about taxes next. Okay. So when we're doing this calculation in Excel, that change, right, from that in real GDP from that change in investment, notice instead of 200, it's 1,000. So when we're thinking about what that factor of change in real GDP is, we're going to call that the multiplier effect. All right. So I have this calculated over here. So if we had this marginal propensity to consume of zero point 0.8, we thought about last class, we said that this is really taking a derivative of that solving for the break-even level of real GDP equation in respect to either investment, government expenditures, autonomous consumption, or net exports. So for now, we were just looking at a $200 change in investment. So the factor by which that change will increase real GDP is going to be 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. When we took a derivative of y in respect to I, this is what we were left with. So this would be the change in real GDP from a $1 increase in investment. So for us, when investments were going up by 200, the factor of increase should be that times 5 or 1,000. Now, if we go back to that function, if we take a derivative in respect to any of these 4 components, we should get that same real GDP change. So let's say I go back here, I change investments to the normal level, nothing's changed. Let's say instead autonomous consumption goes up by 200. That multiplier effect should be the same, and we should get that same change in real GDP. Okay. And we could do this for any one of those factors, right? So maybe government spending goes up by 200, we get that same change, or a $200 change is getting multiplied by that multiplier effect. Every dollar spent is increasing real GDP by 5 or getting us that change of 1,000. Okay. Any questions on that idea? So the next thing I wanted to kind of show you is what if we had that same $200 increase? And let's say we could go back to not government spending, but we could do the original example, which was an increase in investment in physical capital. Well, what should our new multiplier effect be if instead the marginal propensity to consume is lower? Well, if we think about that multiplier effect, if this is lower, we're subtracting a smaller value, right? That would increase our denominator, which should decrease this overall fraction or lower our multiplier effect. Because every additional dollar, consumers are spending less of it, right? So that would push down kind of this impact of an additional dollar, right? It's going to not have a 0.8 impact, but a 0.6. So what's our new multiplier effect? 1 over 1 minus that marginal propensity to consume. So if we see a $200 increase, The effect on real GDP should be that times the effect of $1 or our multiplier effect, and we get 500. Okay? So notice if instead I had a marginal propensity to consume of zero point 0.6, it's going to update all of these here. Nope, maybe it's not. I thought I had these set in. Oh, this is the one that I had set. Hold on. Let's go back here. All right. So notice here, if I had this marginal propensity to consume of zero point 0.6, right? Now, when I look at that same $200 increase in investment, it's only increasing my real GDP by now instead 500. Okay? So decreases in that marginal propensity to consume will make any increase in any one of these four components have a smaller impact on real GDP or decrease that change. Okay? Any questions over anything there before we move on to taxes? All right. So what if instead we go back to the original example, because I think this matches up with the slides. Oh, went back one, two, too far. So let's say instead we have this original scenario, no change in investment, but the change that we see is in taxes. So now let's say taxes go up by 150 to 250. Actually, to keep this constant, I could show the same, it prove the same thing here, but let's just make this the same $200 change, right? 150 to 350. Okay. If that's the case, we notice our old GDP and our new GDP, we've actually seen it go down, right? So that change is not an increase of 1,000, but a decrease of 800. So why? Well, if taxes go up, people have less available funds to spend. That break-even level of GDP is going to be lower than it was before. Our kind of equilibrium level of real GDP will be lower. How much lower? Well, once again, even though taxes change by 200, people don't spend all of that additional, right? Um, every dollar increase isn't going to be completely spent. And so when we were thinking about that tax, we were subtracting that to get our level of disposable income, the money we can actually spend. It was our nominal income, or you can think about it as our real income, technically, minus those taxes. So instead of just a $200 change in GDP, we get an $800 change. So when I'm thinking about the tax change multiplier, it's going to be a little bit different than just a change in consumption, government spending, net exports, or investments. The reason why is because if we go back to our equation, notice all of these essentially have like a 1 in front of them. If we take a derivative of y in respect to t, it's negative marginal propensity to consume divided by 1 minus marginal propensity. So we'd be left with negative MPC divided by 1 minus MPC. So here I didn't even include that multiplier effect. But if I did calculate it, it's that marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So notice a $200 increase in taxes should change our GDP by that times the tax multiplier. Now notice the tax multiplier is always going to be less than our multiplier effect for any other component. I'll draw this out here in a second for us why, but for right now, we can see that it's lower. Now, I forgot something here. Yes, the change of $200 in taxes will change my real GDP by 800, but notice in that equation, what was in front of taxes? A negative sign, right? So I forgot here, yes, the multiplier is 4, but any increase in taxes is actually going to decrease real GDP by that amount. So sure enough, we should see an $800 decrease. Okay. Um, and just to give some support behind why, so I had the multiplier effect and then the multiplier effect for taxes. So for anything else, it was 1 over n, 1 over 1 minus MPC. Here it was negative MPC over 1 minus MPC. If the marginal propensity to consume is always less than 1, then this numerator is always going to be less than this numerator, which means that that multiplier effect has to be lower, right? Because 1 over the same thing, this value will always be less than 1. And we can ignore the negative sign here because we're just thinking about the absolute value. Okay. Now, one thing I'll add in here, if we look back at that break-even level equation, remember our expenditures are C plus I plus G plus net exports, which are exports minus imports. So we're going to ignore taxes for a second. What would the multiplier effect be for imports? Well, it's still going to be 1 over 1 minus MPC, but notice there's a negative sign in front. So if imports go up, right, and here we had a $200 change was our example, that real kind of level of GDP or that break-even level is going to go down, right, by 200 times whatever that multiplier effect was. I think we had it was 4. So the change is actually going to be, oh, sorry, it wasn't 4. It was 5. So instead of going up by 1,000, like when we had investments or government spending changing, it's going to go down, right? And we can see that from the Excel file. Let's say I had a second scenario that I'm comparing to this first one. So I'm going to just copy and paste this down here. So we can think about this one, change in imports. This one was a change in taxes, right? And then this one, we were just thinking about changes in AC, I, G, or net exports. And I'll kind of, oh, where do I want this? Just so we can kind of see this. And I'll post this one after class today, since it'll be the complete example. So if instead we had those initial values, but instead we saw imports go up by 200. Or what did I say? Yes, up by 200. So instead of negative 25, this should be what? 175. It went up by 200. So if imports go up, no, sorry. Imports went up by 200. So instead of negative 25, this would be negative 225. Okay. So what we'll notice is when I make this calculation, what was the change in real GDP? Well, here's my new GDP minus my old, all the way up here, my old GDP. This was like our original scenario. We see that it's went down by 1,000. Okay. And the reason why is because imports have this negative sign out front of them. So an increase in imports is actually decreasing net exports. So it's still going to have a factor of 5 change on real GDP. But as imports go up, we were subtracting them. So our real GDP would then go down by whatever that multiplier effect was. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So kind of went through this. So the next thing I want to kind of look at is thinking about this multiplier effect. And I kind of already alluded to this, but when we have, let's say, the same $100 increase, what is that multiplier effect going to be? Well, it's 1 over 1 minus MPC. So we said as that marginal propensity to consume goes up, people are spending more of their money. That same change in autonomous consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports will actually increase real the multiplier effect is larger, multiply that by 100, and we can see that change in real GDP from that same $100 increase is larger as we have consumers spending more of that autonomous consumption increase. Okay. And then we walked through kind of how taxes look a little bit different as well. We did that in the Excel file. And I have here, no change in prices of price. Okay, so this would be kind of the next concept. So we kind of covered all of this. The next thing I want to go through is, so we have these changes in any one of these factors of GDP, but if they change, prices might adjust. So I want to go through one more thing that'll set us up for this. Probably don't need to, but I think it's worthwhile to kind of revisit this. So we were thinking about when we were graphing this, we had when consumption is equal to the disposable income, this is like MPC is equal to one, people are spending everything. Disposable income is the exact same as consumption. However, we know that actual consumption, or we could think about this as actual expenditures, so not just consumers, but investment, government spending, net exports. If any one of those changed, the old break-even level, so we could think about this as like our initial kind of break-even GDP. Let's say that we saw autonomous consumption, investments, government spending, or net exports if they went up. So all of those things we said is going to increase our real GDP, or sorry, increase, our real GDP, which would increase this actual level of consumption, right? There's more money. One of these things increased, so there's more available disposable income or funds. What's that going to do to our new break-even level? Well, all those examples we looked at in Excel, the change in real GDP, it went up. Okay. So any one of these changes increases actual consumption, making our new break-even level higher. So another question you could be asked is after we see this change, what happens to savings? Well, when we're thinking about the break-even level, savings is always kind of what our disposable income is minus that actual consumption, right? So if actual consumption is greater than the current level of available resources or income, we've got negative savings. We're spending more than we have available. So let's say I gave a follow-up question. I told you there's a change, and I said not what's currently happening to savings. Well, at the new point, actual consumption is equal to the potential consumption. So I can think about this 45-degree line as like my potential consumption. If we had the same level of disposable income as before, what would be true? So if I have the same level of disposable income as before, I'm not looking at that new break-even level. Now, if we didn't change how much we're consuming, now when we look at actual consumption relative to that old disposable income is now, here, I'll do it this way. Disposable income, if we were to look at the old level, is now less than my actual consumption, which means my new savings, if this is smaller than this, has to be negative. So if we don't adjust to this change, right, we would say that there's dissavings. Or remember, any value below our break-even level would now produce dissavings. Any level above would now produce savings. Now, the exact opposite is going to hold. So let's say we saw an increase in taxes or an increase in imports. So we said both of these things, when they go up, we have less available funds in our domestic economy. So that's actually going to cause a decrease in actual consumption. So maybe I think about this as like scenario three. This is scenario two. Well, now if that's the case, our new break-even level is going to be at a lower level of real GDP. Okay. And then we kind of have the exact opposite effects. Now, actual consumption, if we were to kind of keep it the same, would be below, or sorry, actual consumption would be below the disposable income, in which case we would have positive savings if we didn't adjust that break-even level, just as kind of a hypothetical question, just kind of get at that concept. But the actual change in real GDP that comes from those taxes or imports pushes real GDP to be lower. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? So while we're here, let's instead think about something else, right? So I want to make sure I line this up with the slides. So I've got, what did I do? Let's see real quick. I did a price increase. Okay. Sorry, let's make sure. Okay. So let's start out thinking about we have this level, this break-even level of real GDP. We've got this 45-degree line where consumption was equal to disposable income. And then we had like actual consumption compared to potential consumption. We said when they're exactly the same, this was kind of our break-even level of real GDP. Well, if prices adjust, right? And let's say we have a price increase. What did the price increase do to our real GDP? Okay. So we said that real GDP was equal to the nominal GDP divided by this deflator. And then as prices went up, the deflator goes up, sending our real GDP to be lower. So if prices increase, we can think about it as at every disposable income value, there's less real income or less real GDP. So when we see prices adjust, our actual consumption is now going to be lower than it was before, which does what? Pushes our real GDP after a change, after a price change. So I can think about this as like when prices are higher to be lower than it was before. Right? So even if we saw an increase in actual consumption, if prices adjust, that's going to push that consumption line down. Okay? So even though we were predicting that in our example, and I think we had a what, $200 change in the Excel example, it increased GDP by 500, or sorry, by a factor of five, which is 1,000. If prices adjust, that change won't be 1,000. It's going to be something less than that, right? Because that higher prices, that price adjustment pushes that break even level down. Okay. So if we're thinking about what this looks like, we said that when we were looking at that multiplier effect, it assumed no changes in prices. However, if they do adjust and they increase, that multiplier effect essentially weakens, right? Because our consumption is worth less in terms of real value, right? Because prices are now higher, we can buy fewer goods and services. Um, so instead of increasing by a factor of five, if prices go up, it won't change by as much. So we can kind of see, just a visual depiction here. We can actually relate this to what we were talking about back in module 6, that even though we saw changes in this real GDP from the initial point of 500, when prices adjust, right, even if we have an aggregate demand increase, so real GDP was going up, we said it was going from 500 to 1,000, that $500 increase. As prices go up, that aggregate demand essentially, right? When we have higher prices, that same aggregate demand shift, our real GDP won't be out here. The equilibrium is going to be where that new aggregate demand in the short run hits our short run aggregate supply. So at higher price levels, that GDP is actually going to be, or equilibrium of GDP is going to be lower. So we don't get a $500 increase like the multiplier effect would predict when prices adjust and they increase because of these demand shifts, right? We're actually going to see the real level of GDP fall, which was exactly what we had predicted here. So just kind of two different models, right? There's different things on the X and Y axis here, so it looks different. We're modeling different things, but both of them predict that in the short run, when prices adjust, we get that same change in our real GDP from an increase in consumption, investment, government spending, net exports isn't going to be as large as we would predict. Okay. Could we just quantify the real level price changes? Here? Yeah, I would only expect you to know it weakens, right? We don't know by how much in terms of what we're going to go, the scope of this class. We're just, really the concept I would ask you questions about is not combine price adjustments with these other changes, simply what is the impact of price adjustments. So when prices go up, we know that real level of GDP would actually go down, or the effect would be smaller if prices went down, which they shouldn't in adjustment to these demand shifts, but if they did, then we would see kind of that real level actually increase. Right? Or if for some reason, when we have an aggregate demand increase, that prices went even lower, um, we would see that real GDP goes up. But that won't be the response, right? And we know that won't be the response because the other model we have predicts that when we have aggregate demand increases or increases in spending, our new short run, right? Short run supply isn't horizontal. We had this kind of hybrid model of Keynesian and classical. So we had this increasing short run aggregate supply. Increases in aggregate demand don't push real GDP out quite this far, as if prices didn't adjust, prices will always adjust to be higher, right? So there, it's really thinking about, we're really only looking at one direction when we talk about price changes. Okay. But we could go the other direction. Okay. Um, and then I kind of already looked at this off the slides, but right, when prices increase, that pushes our real GDP or actual consumption line to be lower, making that real GDP break even level to be lower than it was. Okay. And this really, you can think about what happens with aggregate demand as real GDP, or say what happens to real GDP as prices go up, the real GDP is going to fall. Okay. And this was just the idea. That's essentially what that equation I had when prices go up, our deflator increases, taking the same nominal GDP to making it a lower real GDP value. Okay. Where are we at on time? No, I don't know where I put my phone. We'll see here in a second. Any questions on that before I keep moving here, jump into the next module? Okay. So the next thing we're going to do, if I can get Zoom to move here, is look at module 8. Okay. So module 8, we're going to start focusing more on this investment component of GDP, and we're going to think about the market for loanable funds. Okay. So we thought about economic growth before. We said, what's the only way we get a change in the long run GDP was a change in long run aggregate supply or changes in pull, right? So we're going to focus on physical capital. That was one of the things that could change. So we had land, resources, physical capital, but we could also see, we said before, changes in productivity, labor supply, education. We're going to just focus on that other category of physical capital. Now, technically, it was other, right? So physical capital, land, natural resources. We were kind of focusing on this physical capital category. So one thing with physical capital, and we went through this a little bit in the previous module, was that we know that some of our physical capital, so machinery is going to wear down, software becomes irrelevant. So the capital we have in the following time period will be whatever our kind of physical capital was. Actually, sorry. I copied and pasted and forgot to update this subscript. So it's going to be whatever our physical capital was before, plus the investments we made, minus the depreciation to those physical capital assets we already had. So with this idea in mind, right, if we're thinking about that equation for physical capital, we can look at what the actual data tells us. So if I'm looking at investment rates, right, that was our physical capital. As we have higher levels of physical capital, so our investment is greater than depreciation. If we're looking at all these countries, ones that had higher investment rates tend to have higher real GDP values as well, right? This was an increase in physical capital. One of the factors of pull should increase our real GDP. Okay. So we're not making these things up. The data kind of supports this. So when we're thinking about the financial system, right? How do you obtain funds? Well, you could take on a partner, or you could see companies merge. You could borrow, right, from a bank or from the government, right? Or you could take some of your profits and reinvest them back into your firm. So there's multiple ways of increasing our investment in physical capital. We're going to really think mainly about this. choice or decision to kind of borrow money to make these investments. So the types of sources we have indirect financing. So we could use financial products, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, to kind of obtain these funds to invest in the physical capital. Direct financing, I think I said stocks and bonds here, sorry. Stocks and bonds are direct financing. If we're taking money from these from companies, this is going to be investments we make, hoping stocks and bonds, increase. So, we won't really focus too much on this, but these are kind of our different sources. So, kind of setting us up here, we're going to focus today on the bond market. So a bond is something that I invest in, right? And it promises to pay me a certain amount, right? So I'm taking on debt, I'm getting money loaned out, and uh, whoever is loaning it out, when you're taking out this money, you promise to pay them an amount back in the future, right? So we've got kind of the lender, right, who's loaning these funds. They buy the bond, and then the borrower promises to kind of sell that bond back to them at a higher amount, right? So I'm promising to pay them back whatever that price was plus an additional amount, right? Why would I give someone $1,000 if they're only giving me $1,000 back tomorrow? I'm not making any money off this. I'm just hoping they pay me back, right? So I'm going to require not just that same $1,000 back, but something higher than that. So the coupon rate of a bond, we're going to say, okay, what's the cost of borrowing? If I give $1,000 to someone, they're going to have to pay me something back greater than 1,000, right? So, for example, if I lend out $1,000, that borrower is promising to pay me 80 additional dollars in the following year or 1,080. Right? So the way that we kind of calculate these coupon rates is whatever that promise, the additional amount they're promising to pay back over the additional amount that they are borrowing or the additional price of that bond. So whenever we make this kind of coupon rate calculation, it's just like everything we've done before. When we calculate it this way, this is like the coupon rate. If we want it as a percentage, we would just multiply by 100. So when we look at that equation for calculating the coupon rate, let me see. I'm going to skip ahead here and come back to this slide. Where is it at? There we go. This would be the equation that we're using. Whatever that promise to pay back the additional amount is, whatever that coupon payment is over the price, multiplied by 100 gives us that coupon rate as a percentage. So what's going to impact this, right? If I'm loaning money to someone, when will I require for the same $1,000 amount that I'm lending out? When would I require higher payments in the future, right? Or a higher coupon rate? Right? You can think about coupon rates as essentially like interest that someone's paying on the loan. So if I see an increase in the risk of defaulting, right, I think that, yeah, I'm giving this person 1,000 and they're promising to pay me back $80. But I'm not real confident that they might, they might go bankrupt. They might not be able to pay it back. Well, if I'm taking on more risk, what am I going to want? I'm going to want a higher additional return on my investment or a higher coupon rate, which means that amount that someone is promising to pay me above that original price is going to have to be higher. So instead of $80, I might want them to promise to give me 200 tomorrow, right? Because it's riskier, right? They might default. So anything that increases the risk of me lending out this money, right? The risk of a borrower defaulting, I'm going to require a higher coupon payment, which makes that rate higher. Okay. Um, any questions on that? Should be, I don't think, too crazy of an idea. So the rest of what we're talking about is essentially you can always kind of think about it or relate it to this idea of the risk of default. So if the bond is issued for a longer period of time, so they don't just have to pay me back tomorrow, they're going to have to pay me back in 5 years. Well, the longer the time frame, the more likely that there's things that can happen that the individual borrowing the money can't pay me back. So, excuse me, longer periods of time make it more likely they're going to default, which requires higher coupon payments or increases that coupon rate. Or we can think about it, I would have to be paying as the borrower a larger interest rate. Okay. Now that's like I said, the longer the time, essentially there's more default, right? Or more likelihood of default. So the higher the time period, the increase that we'd see in that coupon rate or the increase in interest rates. What about the amount of the loan? Well, even if I'm giving out the loan for 1 year, if someone's borrowing $1,000 from me, well, if instead they want to borrow 10,000, well, now the risk if they do default is a lot higher, right? Because if they default, before I lost $1,000, now, or 1,000 plus the additional amount to pay back. Now I'm going to lose 10,000 plus the additional amount they promised to pay back. So essentially, when the amount of the loan is higher, I am less likely to want to give you that money at the same rate. The only way you can convince me to kind of give you that loan is if I increase the interest rate or the coupon rate on it. I'm going to require you to give me or promise to give me more money in the future because it's a higher risk to me if I'm giving you more money. Okay. So the kind of direction there, once again, higher loan amounts, higher default payment, or sorry, higher risk of default pay on the payment, which would then increase our interest rate or our coupon rate. So those are kind of the things we think about impacting, will we require a higher or lower coupon rate? We look at kind of some of these major kind of issuers of bonds. You can look at the different investments. They rate them like on a system. So these bonds that are like high risk, the people I'm giving them are really high risk, I'm going to have to pay a really high interest rate on those. If they're um, bonds or investments that, it's more likely I can pay them back, well, these kind of bond rating is more likely that they're going to pay me back. I would see kind of lower coupon rates on these or lower interest rates. So if we look at this by country, just thinking about default risks, what countries have higher ratings or essentially have lower default risks? It's going to be more advanced economies, right? And then less advanced economies, kind of we're thinking about, the orange and kind of red levels here. Well, they're more likely to default, and so they're not going to be able to purchase these bonds that have lower rates. They're going to have to pay higher rates. Okay. So with this in mind, we kind of talked about how can we calculate these bond rates. It's going to be using this equation. Make sure I'm paying attention to time here. Okay, so we got 30 minutes. We're still good. All right. So assume that we have a coupon rate of 8% or 0.08. If the current price of that bond is 1,600, how do I figure out what that rate is? It's just a matter of plugging these values in, right? 1,600 over that promise to pay back. If that rate is 0.08, the amount that I must be promising to pay back is just rearranging this equation a little bit. So I kind of take that coupon rate, it was 8%, I divide it by 100, that's 0.08, multiply both sides by the price of that bond, and I get that in order to have an 8% coupon rate, the amount that someone has to promise to pay me back if the current price is 1,600 would be $128. All right. Now, what happens as the price of that bond increases? Well, if the price of that bond increases, if we kept the coupon rate the same, right, what would have to be required, right? Well, if the price goes up, to keep that coupon rate at the same 8%, I'm going to require a higher payment. Right? Now we can see this. If instead we had a price of 2,200, to keep that rate the same at 8%, what would the payment have to be? Just using this new price, they're going to have to promise to pay me back not $128, but $176, right? And that's if we keep the rate the same, right? If we then think about, well, if the default rate is higher, right, am I going to, if I'm getting the same coupon rate, what am I going to want to do the price of the bond, right? Well, if it's more likely they're going to default, I want to charge them a higher interest rate or a higher coupon rate. What's the way that I can do that? Well, I would either require a higher payment here, right? Excuse me, or I would have to kind of, sorry, if I want a higher return on investment, I would require kind of either a higher payment, right? Or I would kind of see the price of that bond go down. So let's think about if I have the price going up, it's going to lower the kind of coupon rate, keeping the payment the same. To get that rate to be higher, I'm going to have to decrease the price of the bond. Okay. So if we think about, where do I want to go here? Oh, sorry. So if I think about someone purchasing a stock, right, and they're paying dividends to shareholders, essentially I'm giving them money, I'm lending them money, and I'm hoping that down the road I'm paid back even more, right? So when we're selling kind of these stocks, right, we have to promise to pay back more in the future, or essentially the interest rates are going to be increasing, right? The more money I want to take, that higher that default risk, I'm going to have to promise that I'm paying back more in the future. So typically, when we compare bonds to stocks, we see higher interest rates because bonds are typically taken from governments. We don't expect them to quote unquote go out of business, right? Or we expect the government to be more likely to pay those back. Individual firms, they could more likely that they don't exist in the future. And so we would require higher rates because the default risk is going to be higher. Right? So essentially, why are the interest rates higher on stocks than bonds? More risk, right? More default risk. Same kind of thing, concept we were talking about before. Um, So what should tell us something about how likely the default risk is? Okay. Well, essentially, we're looking for prices there, right? So I can think about if I wanted to know, let me think how I want to show you guys this. So here, let's go here. So I'll show you this example and then we'll kind of break it down with an equation. So um, let's assume that we look at two companies, right? And we look at the kind of price of their stock, right? Why would if I'm comparing Pepsi to Jones Soda, right? I might think that the default risk, right, from Pepsi is going to be a lot lower, right? So what are people willing to do, right? They're willing to pay higher prices because they don't think, right, that company is going to default on their promise to pay back. So if I think that they're not going to default, right, I would actually require um, lower real rates, right? Which the only way that that kind of happens is if the price, right? If we go back to this equation, if I require lower rates with the same coupon payment, I would actually need to kind of have higher prices, right? And the reason why I'm willing to give lower rates to Pepsi is because I think that their likelihood of defaulting is lower. So I'm willing to pay that higher price. Okay. Um, so the fact that trying to move my mouse here, so give me a second. There we go. So if I'm thinking about, I can think about these coupon rates as essentially interest rates. So if I have a stable company or a stable stock, I'm willing to kind of, um, you can think about it as when I'm investing in them, I don't require as high of a rate because they're more stable. There's less default risk. Whereas if I have an unstable stock, right, the interest rate that I'm going to want paid back to me, right, is going to have to be much higher, right? Because I'm not sure if they're going to exist in the future. So if we kind of write this out, we kind of had essentially whatever that coupon rate was or that promise to kind of pay back over the price of that stable bond. Let's say we have the same kind of rate here, but I've got the price of the unstable bond, right? Well, they've got the same numerator. So if they're promising to kind of pay back the same amount, what would have to be true is 1 over the price of the stable bond is less than 1 over the price of the unstable bond. If I multiply both sides with that denominator, this would, this would kind of stay the same. So if I'm multiplying both sides here, what has to be true at that same payment, the price of that stable bond is going to be greater than the price of that unstable bond, right? Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? And we see that kind of play out when we're looking at those stock prices. stable bond, or I said bond, but stable stock is going to have a much higher price. Okay. All right. So we went through this already. There we go. So mutual funds are kind of a similar idea. Once again, instead of coupon rates, we're just thinking about interest rates. So why would we expect um, a portfolio of stocks, right? Why would we think that their interest rates are higher or lower? So if I'm buying a stock in one company compared to a mutual fund that has several companies involved in it, what's happening to my risk of default? Well, when I'm investing into one company, if they go under, that's I lose my entire investment. If I've got a portfolio of several companies, if one of them defaults, it doesn't hurt me as bad, right? So I'm kind of what we would call diversifying, right? In these stocks where I'm lowering my risk. So what's happening when I invest into a higher number of firms? I'm essentially lowering my default risk. Oh, and so if I'm lowering my default risk, what's going to happen to the interest rate that I'm going to get? It's going to be lower than before, right? Higher default risk, I'm going to require higher interest rates or higher amounts that I'm going to have to be paid back. Whereas if the default risk is low, I'm not going to require as much paid back to me in the future, or I would accept lower interest rates or lower rates of return, if you want to think about it that way. So setting all of this up, we then want to think about how do we determine the equilibrium interest rate of mutual funds, stocks, bonds, etc. Because they all offer different. There's this default risk idea, but we're going to think about this more from an economy's perspective. Right? So if we go back to the expenditure model, we had our real GDP, it's consumption, investment, government spending, to exports. We're using a lot of the same things here. For right now, we're going to assume, just to make some of the math a little bit easier, excuse me, that we have a closed economy. We're just going to ignore exports and imports for right now. Okay. So there, I'm kind of just left with, C plus I plus G. We've gotten rid of net exports just for the sake of kind of simplifying this model for now. I mean, I say for now, I'm not going to add them in this course, but you could once you kind of move to the next level. So if I just rearrange this equation, I'm thinking about the investments that are being made in the physical capital. So the amount of money that people are, or companies are getting loans for so they can invest in the physical capital. This is the idea of what are companies really doing with their stocks? They're someone else is buying their stock. They're, promising, or so they're purchasing the stock that gives the firms, right, or gives the economy additional money to invest in the physical capital. Okay. So when we rearrange this, thinking about this investment, right, it's going to be the real GDP minus consumption and minus government spending. We're just rearranging this equation. So we're going to call this the national level of savings, right? Whatever our real GDP is minus consumption and government expenditures, that's the amount of savings or investment that we have kind of going into capital. So with this idea in mind, right, I'm then going to break this down into two components. So we're going to call this public and private savings. So public and private savings. Private savings is going to be what household savings are after they pay taxes, but then also consumers or households receive government transfers, right? This is the idea of, um, even you get as students like federal aid, right? You can think about government assistance. All of these are going to be transfers that increase the overall amount of savings that household or amount of available funds households have for savings. So private savings, we're going to take whatever the real GDP is, however they're spending, right? We're going to take out consumption. We're going to take out the amount of taxes they have to pay, but they're given this additional transfer value or kind of transfers from the government, right? So that's going to be not subtracted. That's going to be getting added into savings. Okay. That's funds they're not spending, but that they're receiving. Okay. So that's our private savings. Public savings is going to be kind of the government or government revenue. We can think about it that way. So how much money does the government have to put into savings? Well, it's however much revenue they're earning from taxes minus government spending, but then also they have to pay these transfers to consumers So we're kind of subtracting their expenditures from their overall revenue. Revenues minus expenditures would be our savings. Right? So there we've got taxes minus government spending, excuse me, minus our transfers, or revenue transfers, should be more specific. So when we talk about public savings, start to look at questions that we could see on the quiz or the exam. When when we are referencing budget surpluses or budget deficits, we're not talking about national savings. We're referring to the budget of the government or our public savings. So there, if public savings is greater than zero, we have a budget surplus. Like governments have a budget surplus. If it's ever negative, we have a deficit. Okay. So we can look at some of the values here in 2024. If we were to kind of think about the amount of money that the government was spending, 6.7 trillion, they were earning just under 5 million, or sorry, million, trillion in tax revenue. So we had what? Well, revenue was less than these expenditures, so we had a deficit. Any questions on that before we keep moving? All right. So I think here, for the sake of time, we'll leave things here, right? So next class, we're going to think about how do we break these two types of savings down, thinking about the relationship to national savings, thinking about the effects of budget surpluses. We're then going to think about how do we determine what the equilibrium interest rates are. And then we should be able to kind of finish the rest of Module 8 tomorrow. So what I want to do here today, and let's give us a little bit more review, is take a look at this daily quiz. And we'll kind of go back. This is going to be related to Module 7. It just gives us some additional practice. This will be in the video I posted for review, similar types of questions, but I wanted to kind of go through some here today. So once you open up, I think I've got set for 15 minutes, so that'll go through the end of class, so we should be fine. So we're going to think about this first question. So we left off Module 8. We're going to go back to Module 7 and do a little review here today. So we've got in the question 1, assume that we have a consumption function. We've got the current level of taxes, and I want to think about if I see an increase in autonomous consumption, what happens to my break-even level of GDP? And then if I see an increase in taxes, what's going to happen to that real level of GDP? So just looking for what the increase or decrease is in terms of the value. So we said, how do we calculate that break-even level of GDP? When we rearranged that equation, it was autonomous consumption plus investments, government spending, net exports, minus our marginal propensity to consume times taxes, divided by 1 minus that marginal propensity to consume. So we said anytime there's a change in any one of these factors, our multiplier effect was 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So here I think we had autonomous consumption was 800, marginal propensity to consume was 0.65. Right? That came from our consumption function, which was okay. So we could look at one of these other components. I'm just going to focus on these two, autonomous consumption and taxes. Right? And we can have to rewrite this when we look at taxes, but right now we're just going to look at autonomous consumption. So if I had what taxes go up, no, autonomous consumption go up by 100, what was that multiplier effect? Or 100 times 1 over 1 minus 0.65, which I think, oh, I had these numbers written down, but I might have to put them into my calculator here because I forget exactly what they were. So we have what? 1 over 1 minus 0.65 equals that times 100. So this multiplier effect, if we were to calculate this, is 2.86 approximately. So a $100 increase should increase that break-even equilibrium real level of GDP by 2.86. So when I'm looking at this question, what's going to happen to that break-even level of GDP? It's going to go up by not 2.86, right? We have to multiply that by what the change was in autonomous consumption, which was $100. So we should have it increases by $286. Okay. Now, if we had that same $100 increase in taxes, what's going to happen? Well, if taxes go up by 100, right? Well, the marginal propensity to consume impacts that multiplier effect for taxes a little bit differently. We said that's going to be equal to negative marginal propensity to consume, right? Because that's what taxes are getting multiplied by over 1 minus that marginal propensity to consume. So here we would have a multiplier effect of what? 0.65 over 1 minus 0.65. So I enter this in to my calculator here. I get what? 0.65 divided by 1 minus 0.65, 1.86 approximately. Okay. So this multiplier effect is negative 1 point, what did I say, 86, right? We have that negative sign up front. So if taxes go up, that decreases our level of real GDP. So here, if I saw a $100 increase in taxes, the change in my real GDP would be that times the effect of a $1 increase, which is negative 1.86. So we get what? Approximately $186. But not an increase, a decrease. Taxes go up, and this is one way to remember. If taxes go up, there's less available resources, real GDP goes down. If taxes went down, well, then the effect would be there's more available resources and real GDP would go up by that same amount. Now, notice that multiplier effect, we said this earlier, is always lower for taxes in absolute terms. Okay. So there, that same $100 change in taxes is actually going to decrease real GDP, and we had by 186. Okay. Any questions on that before we go to the last question? So on the second question, we have, let's assume prices decrease. So in the slides, and I said in most cases, the adjustment to increases in aggregate demand will be that the economy adjusts and prices will increase. But what would happen hypothetically if prices decreased? Okay. So here we go back to our model where we can think about this two ways, right? So the first is, let's think about, I've got my disposable income, I've got my consumption. If they're exactly the same, we said this is kind of, we're spending all of our resources that we could, or we could think about this as like our potential GDP or our potential consumption if we were spending everything. Now, actual consumption is going to look something like this. And we could think about, here's kind of our break-even level or our equilibrium level of real GDP. If prices go up, wait, did I say price? No, they would decrease in this example. So if prices go down, when people are spending the same amount of money, can they buy fewer or more goods and services than before? They can buy more. I just got $100 in my pocket. If everything's cheaper, I can buy more than before. So at every level of income, my consumption is now going to be higher, which means that new break-even level of real GDP is going to be higher or it's going to increase. Okay. Now, if I was looking at the same level of GDP as before, and so I'm going back to thinking about if I was at the old level with the new level of consumption with these lower prices, what would be true? Well, first of all, if I'm thinking about if I was at the old level, I'm looking here. I know that on that 45-degree line, my real GDP is equal to, I'm spending all of it, that would be my consumption. Now, or I could think about it as I'm spending every single dollar. So we could kind of think about that's my level of disposable income, right? YD. With that increase, if I didn't change, right? If we weren't thinking about the economy adjusting to that new equilibrium, if things didn't change, the actual level of consumption is going to be higher. We said savings is the level of income or the level of available funds minus the actual level of consumption. So if actual consumption is now greater than that available funds, available resources, this would be what? Less than zero, right? Because the actual consumption would now be higher. So we would have negative savings there. Now, that's not the new equilibrium, right? We're just thinking kind of hypothetically, the new equilibrium is going to be out here. And that new equilibrium, what should be true about savings? Anytime we're at this equilibrium real level of GDP, right? That's where consumption, actual consumption was equal to potential consumption. That was where we had savings being equal to zero. But if we didn't look at that new break-even level, we were looking at the old disposable income value with that kind of change in prices. So this was when our prices went down, we would then have kind of dissavings. Right? Any questions on that before I add in one more thing here? So another way of depicting this, we said, was going back to our old model, right? Let's assume that we had our real GDP and prices. We were thinking about where that initial aggregate demand hits our long run, short run aggregate supply. This is kind of where we started out. Initially, that increase in aggregate demand, right? We might think that if prices didn't adjust, so this would be like our real GDP, no price adjustment would be way out here. However, we know that at these kind of, have this aggregate demand increase, our new equilibrium is where aggregate demand hits short run aggregate supply. So the increase that we see in real GDP, it still goes up when we have these aggregate demand changes or anything that would kind of shift this upward, right? So we could think about that was change in autonomous consumption, investment, government spending, but it doesn't increase it by that multiplier effect because as prices adjust, pushing us back to this equilibrium point where short run aggregate supply hits aggregate demand, it's actually going to be at a level of GDP that's a little bit lower. So this increase in prices pushes our real GDP to go down. And then we work through an example where decrease in prices would have the exact opposite effect. Any questions? So then it would get to long run. So yeah, eventually, right? Prices continue to adjust. If we don't see any changes in long run aggregate supply, we're still going to end up at the same real GDP levels. Right? Anything that's kind of shifting our actual kind of level of consumption, increasing the aggregate demand. Yes, we're going to see real GDP goes up, but then as prices adjust, it starts to push real GDP back more and more until we get to that long run outcome. Yep. But we don't have a change in long run aggregate supply, right? That stays the same. The only thing that changed that was these changes in pull, productivity, uh, labor supply, education levels. Here we were just thinking about changes in government spending. That wasn't a factor of pull. Or not necessarily government spending, any one of those kind of categories. Okay. So make sure you're kind of hitting submit there, getting that submitted. I think it's still 3 minutes left to be open. Um, Other than that, before we kind of end class here, just a reminder, by the end of today, make sure you're submitting something for, where is that Canvas discussion. Make sure that you're completing that third quiz, right? And then before tomorrow's class, complete that Module 8 Top Hat reading. And if you can, please try to do this honor lock test as quick as possible so we can make sure we have everything kind of set and squared away for the second midterm on Friday. Okay. And I'll post this in an announcement and mention it as we get closer and closer, but it'll be open the same kind of as the first one, 9:30 to 3:30. Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording here. And then any of you